The man who gets you is going to have a lifetime of misery. Everything's going to be all right. Yes, everything's going to be... What do you want?
Well, who are you?
Who are you?
Well, who are you?
What do you want?
Well, who are you?
I don't know. I'm not quite myself today.
Well, you look perfectly idiotic in those clothes.
These aren't my clothes.
Well, where are your clothes?
I've lost my clothes.
Well, why are you wearing these clothes?
Because I just went gay all of a sudden.
It's ticklish business any way you look at it. Come on, we'll stick together.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Ticklish Business. I'm Kristen, and Emily is not with us for this very special episode, but in her place, we have the amazing author of Running Press and TCM's new book, Hollywood Pride. It's Alonso Duralde. Alonso, how are you?
I'm doing great, Kristen. How's it going?
It's going good. I get to talk to you about this great book. So I feel like I'm starting things on a high note. But before we talk about that, as always, we'd like to briefly remind everyone that if you haven't checked out our Patreon at patreon.com/ticklishbiz, then you should. We do a whole bunch of additional bonus pods, including doubled features, looking at remakes based on a true podcast, looking at biopics and true crime, as well as But Have You Read the Series. I promise all of those shows are coming back. We just did the lineup for the rest of the year, so we are going to start churning those out. Nice. We also are allowing you to vote on what is going to be our International Month film of July. Your choices are The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, La Strada, and Kind Hearts and Coronets. So I have a favorite amongst those, but I'm not going to tell you guys because we want you to vote. And that is for free patrons as well. So even if you aren't a paid person, you can still join for free and vote in that poll. We also give out care packages, movies, and gifts and let you guess on an episode. It's at patreon.com/ticklishbiz. And while we are promoting and talking about Alonso's amazing book, don't forget that I have a book out as well, also through Running Press and TCM, but have you read the book? Emily also has her Viviana Valentine series out as well. You can order those wherever you get books. And our Redbubble store has some great art, all designed by Samantha Richardson and Terrence Hiltz, featuring your favorite stars, including our always popular pirate-themed Makoko mugs. You can find that at ticklishbiz.redbubble.com. The pirate is not in your book, if memory serves, Alonso. Am I correct?
It is not. I do have a whole section about Vincent Minnelli, though, and about Judy Garland, for that matter. So,
I mean, I'll take it. I'm just saying, volume 2, movies that are just incredibly LGBTQ friendly, and I think The Pirate unintentionally is one of them.
Just the way she says Makoko.
It's great. I'd say it at least once a day for no reason other than it's just hysterical. But Alonso, I know when you were writing this book, it was very exciting. I kind of knew about this a lot earlier, I think, because I was talking to Running Press about something else, and they mentioned that this book was coming. So I felt very in the know, knowing this was happening. But can you talk a little bit about how that relationship worked, how you got the gig writing Hollywood Pride?
Sure. Well, not unlike your experience with Have You Read the Book, they came to me on this one, and I had worked with them some before. Running Press had published I'll Be Home for Christmas Movies, which is the book that I did with the Deck the Hallmark podcast about Hallmark Christmas movies. And then I had worked with the TCM folks on a puzzle. They reached out to me. They did
I remember the puzzle.
Yeah, it was a 2-sided puzzle, 50 male movie stars on one side, 50 female movie stars on the other. And they brought me in to sort of help come up with who the 100 were going to be. And then also I wrote mini biographies of each celeb. So there's a little booklet that comes with the puzzle where I've given you like a précis of like their life and their career and their importance and movies to check out, blah, blah, blah. I was not unknown to them when they reached out to me that they wanted to do Hollywood Pride, and I'm delighted that they did. I think it's kind of a piece with some other books they've been doing in recent years, Donald Bogle's Hollywood Black, and then a couple years later, Luis Reyes's Viva Hollywood. So, you had the kind of Black Hollywood experience, both on film and the people behind the scenes. Ditto with the sort of Latina Hispanic community. And so now this is the queer version.
Well, and I always tell people when I talk about disability that those issues are not the same. Classic film experience for Black actors, vastly different than the classic film experience for LGBTQ performers, but there are commonalities. The situations are often analogous. What were the things that you wanted to, I don't want to use the word dispel, but I think there are often a lot of stereotypes and assumptions made about LGBTQ performers of the studio era, that they all had to hide who they were, lavender marriages. That often I feel like they think that happens more commonly than it actually did. But what were the things you wanted to really kind of touch on and in some cases debunk about that experience?
I didn't really come in with a particular agenda about that. It was really just more trying to kind of wrap my arms around this history. And, we've had the Celluloid Closet, which was a very useful text for me in terms of talking about the history of queer representation in films and storytelling and characters and that kind of thing. Obviously, we lost Vito Russo in the early 90s, so there's several decades worth of additional history to go into. And then I was marrying that with the kind of the behind the scenes of it all, which William Mann had covered brilliantly in Behind the Screen, where he talked to a lot of survivors of that era and got into not just the stars and the directors, but also, the writers and the production designers and hairdressers and costumers and all these folks. And so I was just kind of trying to do justice to the many, many people who made classic Hollywood and beyond happen in the first place, and so it was important to try and not just talk about James Whale and Vincent Minnelli and George Cukor, but also to talk about Travis Banton, or Sidney Gieleroff. I mean, like the people who were really kind of behind the scenes and really, are part of queer film history, even if they never worked on an actual queer film themselves. I love the story of James Crabe, who was this cinematographer who came up out of an organization called the Gay Girls Writing Club, where, it was gay men in the film industry and drag queens. They would make campy short films and screen them, just to amuse each other at at bars or in parties or whatever. And then he goes on to be the cinematographer on films like Rocky and The Karate Kid. There is a history of queer film and queer storytelling, but there's also this queer history that's essential to movies that aren't queer at all.
Well, you brought up Vito Russo, and the Celluloid Closet, I know, is often most people's gateway if they're interested in that history. And that documentary coming out when it did often does emphasize the wins, but it's also emphasizing the tragedies. There's a whole section about how often classic studio era films resulted in the deaths of the main characters or characters that were coded as being queer. Think of like The Children's Hour,
Sure.
and Shirley MacLaine. But your book, I mean, I think it's a very balanced celebration of that time period. How did you look at some of these performers of the studio era who were making these movies? And I guess, how do you get out of that spiral of emphasizing it was bad. It was so bad. As most representation tends to be, it gets bad before it gets better.
I found it really fascinating. And the thing I guess I wasn't as fully aware of was the fact that not only did the code dictate what could be shown on screen and what you couldn't say or show or do, but how much it sort of bled into the private lives of stars, where studios were like, no, this is the image we are promoting. Hollywood, everybody thinks we're this, sinful cesspit. And so we're going to put this very kind of cozy, family forward, innocuous, kind of heteronormative image of ourselves out to the rest of the world. And so it's not just about movies now suddenly having to have one foot on the floor or whatever, but it's about movie stars having to put on this performance in their personal lives about who they are and how they live.
You and I both know the classic film community, not to disparage any of the wonderful people that listen to my podcast, but when you're talking about sexuality with
Sure.
people that have been dead for several decades, there is an air of sensitivity to it. We can't know that these people were gay or straight. We're making assumptions based on things. For you, when you're writing a book about this, I mean, the cover is Tab Hunter and Marlena Dietrich and Anna May Wong. How did I guess you settle on the topics you're picking when there is that concept of certain people weren't out, especially in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s.
Talk about this in the foreword to the book. When you're dealing with LGBTQ history, especially in the entertainment industry, where a lot of people were leading these hidden lives or double lives or whatever, you do have to rely on gossip to a certain extent. It's not like there are birth certificates or land records that are going to get you the information you need. And so then it becomes a question of whose gossip and how much sort of background do you have, to believe it, and so there were sources that I very early on decided were not going to be ones that I thought were necessarily reliable and ones that I thought were, and I think, again, William Mann in Behind the Screen really kind of, shows his work and talks about, like, has multiple sources and people who were closely involved with the people at question. And so, I get that there is a stripe of classic movie lover that is willing to, that basically thinks that everything the studio publicity department told them is the rock solid truth. If it came out of the Kremlin that was Hollywood in the 1940s, and that we're sticking to that, and that's all there is to it. And so I was thrilled that TCM understood that I was going to be talking about people that maybe, there would be still some issues. And certainly I try to be very clear about, look, we just don't know about things, but there has been talk, there have been memoirs, there are red flags along the way, and so I felt it would be remiss to not mention them at all. But I also try to be very clear about, like, here's what we know and here's what we think we know, and not try to come at anything from an absolutist point of view, unless it's like, James Whale, we know,
There's a whole movie about it.
Exactly.
But it's the Cary Grant factor, right? That's what I always say.
Sure.
Cary Grant at this point is probably more considered part of the LGBTQ canon for classic cinema, even though he was married 3 times and has a child. But the Ori Kelly documentary comes out.
Right.
Betty White, I think, famously talked about how Cary Grant was gay. I mean, it's the pictures of him and Randolph Scott and their bachelor pad, which are some of my favorite photos of all time.
The house they shared together for a very, very long time, between marriages even,
Exactly. I love it. I wish I could just have those pictures framed in my house because everybody's beautiful. But it is fascinating when, you bring up the Cary Grant of it all and people say, well, he was married 3 times. We don't know.
Well, first of all, bisexuality exists.
Right.
So, that is an option here. And even his daughter, who I think has, she's been on a bit of a journey through all of this. This is a woman who at one point, I think, sued Chevy Chase for calling Cary Grant gay on television, and has subsequently come to say, like, look, if my father was bisexual, I hope he was happy. So she's not acknowledging anything, but at the same time, she's acknowledging the possibility of things. And so for people who've been gone for this long, we're never going to have a firm answer. Does Cary Grant matter in other ways that have nothing to do with his personal life? Absolutely. I think his screen presence is a kind of masculinity that really was very uniquely his. You have the "I just gone gay all of a sudden" joke from Bringing Up Baby at a point where the word gay was starting to mean homosexual, but only within, like, you had to kind of be in the know, but it was happening for sure. I was a male war bride. There's a lot of different things you can point to of, like, whatever his story was off screen, on screen, he's still, like, a figure that matters in the overall examination of queer cinema. And I definitely want to be clear about, when we talk about this stuff, it's because it's important to sort of try and clear the historical record, because there are so many people who want to erase the presence of queer people, the importance of queer people, the fact that we've made contributions to society in every respect. And so just fighting back against that erasure, I think, is more important than a sort of like tee-hee, let's talk about, what he did in bed. For people who think that what he did in bed wasn't important, it's like, well, ideally, yes. But again, if you're going to pretend like, gay people, bisexual people, lesbians weren't part of the culture, weren't contributing to the art that you love now, we have to sort of stake our claim and be like, yeah, we were there, we mattered. And these people who you think of and revere as great artists were also part of that community.
Exactly. I mean, and you think of how many of these stars had that ambiguous sexuality and the ability to make both men and women feel a way. Cary Grant's definitely one of them. Marlene Dietrich is definitely one of them. I mean, there are certain Garbo, exactly. I mean, there were performers at that time whose sexuality I would only love to have thought, to have seen what audiences of the 1940s 30s thought of Marlene Dietrich coming out in Morocco in the suit, kissing a girl and then kissing Gary Cooper. I would love to have asked an audience of men and women, how do you feel about that? What are your thoughts? Because I guarantee you some people who might have already been like, maybe I am one way or another would have been like, nope, I'm just full on bisexual at this point.
There was a great like magazine cartoon in recent years, and it's a little kid going to see Batman and Robin, and he's all pumped to see it, and then you see him like watching the film, and he goes from like smiling to sort of a bit of a furrowed brow, and he walks out, and his brow's still furrowed, and he goes, "Well, I'm definitely not straight."
Exactly. I was just watching Under the Cherry Moon for the first time on Criterion. And I told my mom I was flummoxed that in 1986, Warner Brothers allowed that movie to get made, just threw money at it. And it's such an overt, like, Prince just making men and women horny. And I was just, I was like, in 1986, like, this was just, like, I'm sure Warner Brothers wasn't happy because the movie made no money, but the fact that he just was going to do it and be deliberately just pansexual is fantastic.
Well, I just watched it again this weekend myself, and I'd seen it before, but I'd forgotten how like Jerome Benton is going full on like Franklin Pangborn in this movie. He is really leading into like the kind of Queenie comedy, and it's like, wow, I did not expect that.
Yeah, he's supposed to be the Edward Everett Horton, I think, of the whole thing.
For sure.
And it's just, it's very. I was just like the sexual lines of this movie are amazingly blurred, and in 1986. For Warner Brothers, honestly, I kind of wish I'm like, this is how you get people back into a movie theater. Just give them this. But what I'm also interested, in looking through the book, you talk about, I mean, the obvious heavy hitters. William Haines is a big part of this, often considered now more of a forgotten star, but famously supposedly left Hollywood because they wanted him to get married to a woman he didn't want to, and became a preeminent interior decorator for Hollywood. In your research, I mean, how often was that kind of the option presented to them, which was like, get married or leave the industry?
Well, I mean, I think it's the kind of thing that people don't necessarily talk about. A lot careers end for so many reasons. People sort of fade into smaller roles, or they leave the industry. And so it's not like there's this paper trail you can necessarily follow, but it was not uncommon that those kinds of demands were made of unattached stars, particularly ones who, were living queer lives. I get into it to some extent in the book, and Man is able to go a little deeper and name some more names than I did. But I think that what's fascinating about Haines is not just that he left of his own volition, and again in doing the research, there were differing things. Like Mann's book about Haines, very much makes the case that, that he left because he didn't want to marry a woman. And other sources, including Haines, were like, what? I was like the juvenile lead. And by the time I left, I was like the world's oldest college boy. And it just wasn't, there weren't going to be more roles for me of the kind of thing that I knew how to do, or that I was good at, or that I was most comfortable at. But what's really cool about Haines is that his partner, Jimmy Shields, the two of them become, after, Haines leaves the industry and becomes an interior designer, they become like a very preeminent couple in the Hollywood social scene, and were the only same-sex couple that would do so. Other guys might bring their boyfriend to like, dinner at George Cukor's house or whatever. But in terms of like any kind of societal event where couples came, Haines and Jimmy were a couple, and nobody else was accepted in that way at that time in Hollywood.
That's amazing to think of. I mean, you hear stories as the years pass. I mean, Rock Hudson, once he got divorced, was famously, a lot of people have stories now about him and his various partners and all of that. But again, to be in the 1930s, 1940s, shocking for them, I'm sure. But, I love that they were just the power couple at that time. I'm down for this. Where's that movie?
And look, a reminder that we didn't invent anything. Every generation thinks that they came up with sex, but like this stuff's been around for eons, and it's just a matter of like individual societies and how they decide to treat it. I mean, the reason I start the book in 1895 is because you've got, the Dixon experimental short film, but you've also got the Oscar Wilde verdict. So like from the moment that cinema is born, there is this like societal moment of like, nope, we're not having that. We're not going to do that. And that kind of weighs upon the entire history of the medium.
Well, and you also bring up directors and directors who have crafted, their own path. You talk about John Waters, and you talk about Kenneth Anger, Kenneth Anger. Which I am always fascinated anytime Kenneth Anger comes up, because Hollywood Babylon is both a blessing and a curse.
That was one of the sources I decided not to follow on what was valid gossip or not. It's a great read, but I didn't think it really stood up to much scrutiny.
Exactly. But you also bring up F.W. Murnau, who
Sure.
and it's completely unclear what is true or what is not. But Murnau has kind of fallen into that anger trap at this point, based on how he died. And for people that don't know how Murnau died, he died in a car accident with, I think, like a young 13-year-old boy or something. Like, there was a young guy in the car, and it slowly turned into this whole rumor mongering that.
Right. And I don't even know if he was that young, or maybe he was an employee. Like there's a gajillion versions of that, and a lot of them are quite salacious, but we do know he died in a car accident. That much we know.
And I was going to say, can you talk a little bit about talking about Murnau in this context? Because I think a lot of people, forget his work just in general. I think people just assume Nosferatu were bust. And, for the deep classic film fans, we have this story, which, just kind of survives and transmorgifies and presents a really just, again, ugly, salacious view of his life and career. Have you become a Ticklish Biz patron yet? Well, you should. Just like Allie Moore, Amy Hart, Danny, David Floyd, Donna Hill, Gates, Jacob Haller, Jonathan Watkins, Krista Painter, McF, Rachel Clark, and Shawn Goodreau. Listen to episodes 48 hours early, watch exclusive video interviews, receive merch, and even guests on an episode. You also get access to bonus series like Based on a True Podcast, doubled features, and our latest series, But Have You Read the Series. We're also giving away a massive prize pack to our 50th patron and doing a special theme in July that we've dubbed Don Johnson July. It all starts at $1 at patreon.com/ticklishbiz. Back to the show.
Yeah, no, I mean, Murnau is he and Fritz Lang are sort of the kings of German silent cinema. And, his movie Sunrise was basically, alongside Wings, the first Best Picture winner back when they kind of had two categories for that sort of thing. But yeah, his work is essential. And I think the queerness of his work pops up in different ways, whether it's, in Nosferatu, Count Orlok talking, losing his composure over, the Jonathan Harker character, cutting himself or his neck or whatever. But then also like, Der Januskopf, which is, if Nosferatu is his unauthorized Dracula, this is his unauthorized Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which deals a lot with, duality and the hidden self. And then also his Faust, where you have a man torn between like the love of a pure woman and this male demon who is trying to seduce him in his own way, to bring him around to his side. So, it definitely, it bubbles up in different ways and can be read in the work. But yeah, he's an extraordinary filmmaker, and the idea that he is forgotten saddens me. So I hope people check his stuff out.
Exactly. Well, I mean, and talking about a movie that I think is probably most famous for its queer coding. I don't even know if it's coding at this point. It's pretty much text, but Some Like It Hot. I mean, we just talked about it on the podcast a while back, but I was rewatching it again, and the ending and the fact that just everybody's cool with everybody at the end of that movie. I think, if anything, I'm more struck by the kiss that Tony Curtis's character as Josephine gives to Marilyn Monroe. And Marilyn Monroe, her character at that point has no idea that is a man. It's unlike Victor Victoria, which I love that movie, but I give it guff for the fact that, you know, at a
He has
certain
to
point,
sneak in and check to make sure.
at a certain point, he's aware that she is not a man.
Which they got rid of in the Broadway version, which I give Blake Edwards points for that.
Yes.
He heard the criticism.
But for you, what are some of the landmark classic films that you think are just essential in terms of kind of shaking up, you know, the industry and showing the fact that, yes, I mean, this is not a new topic. It's just eventually things get talked about a bit more openly.
Yeah, you know, I think that during the Code, more was going on than people necessarily give it credit for. You know, I talk about, I sort of in each decade kind of like, well, here's what Hitchcock was up to, you know, because he is giving you Mrs. Danvers and he's giving you Rope and he's giving you like Martin Landau in North by Northwest, like all these very queer coded, if not just queer texted characters, you know, and so it's just a matter of like, you know, how to kind of slip that stuff in a way that I think matters. You know, I think the sort of big attempts to address the elephant in the room have dated really terribly. Like Tea and Sympathy is a tough watch now. And even it is such a kind of, if you compare it to the play that it's based on, such a kind of wimpy take on this whole thing. And it really, as I quote one critic saying, like set in stone a lot of ridiculous misinformation about what being queer was, or like how to deal with it, or that like if you sleep with one woman, you know, you're fixed, you know. So movies like that, or I mean, Suddenly Last Summer is so like they got enough permission from the Catholic League of Decency that they could talk a little about queerness because it's demonizing it, but there's so much talking around the thing.
I'm watching that on Criterion soon. I'm very excited to see it.
So many conversations that are so like, you know what I mean, don't make me say it. What do you mean? You know what I it's exasperating. So, you know, but then you get something like It Hot, which is on its face a just sort of, you know, drag farce. But I think, you know, the moments that you mentioned, but obviously the fact that, you know, I love the Jerry, you know, kind of evolution of this movie, because, you know, he's gonna be Geraldine, but the second they show up, he's Daphne. You know, Josephine is Joe in a girdle and a wig and a dress, but Daphne has arrived. Daphne is a whole person that's been waiting to come out, you know. And so like I think there's a whole thing there of like she's been inside Jerry this whole time waiting for somebody to like give her moment, you know, and so I think that adds a complexity to what would just otherwise be two dudes in a dress, and isn't this hilarious, you know?
Yeah, when I also think of something like Crossfire from 1947, which I don't know if you've seen that. It's a really great movie, but when you do the research on it and you find out that the character who is the victim of this horrific crime was originally written to be gay,
yes.
and they change it to anti-Semitism
Yes.
because of a variety of factors. You know, it does.
And the Lost Weekend, same thing. Yeah. Like they strip out all of the bisexuality of that character, even though the novelist himself was bi and was putting a lot of that into the work.
Yeah, and I mean even Streetcar. You know, again, anytime you're adapting Williams. Yes. But I feel like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the 40s and 50s with the war and with HUAC eventually, like the push towards conservatism and the kind of punting of any queer coding just takes on like, it's like a steel trap. Like it becomes even more pervasive than it was in the 30s or the 60s.
No, definitely. I think that, you know, it's weird during the war. You know, the army actually sent out manuals on how to put on drag shows. to improve morale. Like there were like the Pentagon sent out like, you know, how-tos for these, you know. And so you look at stuff like This Is the Army or whatever, and it's like, you know, the soldiers can't get in drag fast enough. You know, it is such a staple of that thing. But yeah, once the war is over, not only do you have, you know, the McCarthy era and this notion that if you're pink, you're also red, you know, you've also got this terror of this of women having had agency for a hot second during the war. The men are all
Damn
gone.
women.
Exactly. How, they had to leave the house and get jobs in factories. And so once the men are home, it's like, okay, this never happened. Back to the kitchen, ladies. And we'll never talk about this again. And so like you get a movie like Caged, which is on the one hand, a very sort of like kind of social issue. We need to take better care of our prisons movie, but it's also a ladies, behave and you know your role and your place in society and don't step out of line or else it's gonna get ugly.
Isn't there a line in Cage where they're like, if you're here long enough you forget about men or something?
you get out of the habit. And somebody else says, what I wouldn't give for a sink full of dirty dishes. I mean, it's like, so the 50s in a lot of ways are just a horror show for that kind of stuff. And so like I have real compassion for somebody like I write about Roddy McDowall, and I'm like, you know what? He was a kid in the 40s. He's coming of age in the 50s. Like, I get it. I get why, he was just going to be firmly in the closet and live that way professionally. And I can't, from my lofty 21st century perch, be like, oh, well, you should have been more like, no, I get it. I totally get where it is. But that attitude stays with him his entire life. And I quote this anecdote where he's talking to Curtis Harrington about Gods and Monsters, the aforementioned movie about James Whale. And because Curtis Harrington had known Whale and he was a consultant for Bill Condon on the film. So Harrington is telling Roddy McDowall about this movie that's being made. And Roddy McDowall's like, oh, I never knew anybody who had a kind word to say about James Whale. And now he was much better friends with George Cukor and da-da-da. And it's like that. He goes, somebody, Bill Condon says, like, I thought this attitude was dead in Hollywood, but no, it's still alive in Roddy McDowall. The battle between what they call the circumspect and the overt. Well,
and then you get into the late 50s, and I think of something like Rebel Without a Cause, which, I mean, Sal Minio's character is probably one of the more famous coded characters,
sure,
which Minio tried very hard to get out of that mold as he got older, but I think of James Dean as well. Again, when we talk about performers that had that sexuality that could just exude and capture both men and women, and yet only did 3 films, and yet it's sustained. You watch something like, you watch him in Giant, where he's playing opposite Rock Hudson, and it's just amazing to kind of see Hudson's sexuality, which feels firmly heterosexual, and that his whole character is focused on, presenting his son as the most ultimate depiction of masculinity. Like, once you know some of this history of their personal lives, it's really hard, at least for me, I don't know about you, Alonso, it's hard for me not to just kind of like read into things and be like, you think Rock knew when he was reading the script? Like, I'm not sure if they're trolling me or not, but I feel like they might be.
I mean, I think what plays into the conflict of Giant, because Hudson's character and Dean's character are so at odds. Like, I think, the subtextual read is like, Dean is somebody who is very comfortable with his pansexuality, I guess.
Fluidity,
His fluidity. Thank you. He understands that he's got appeal to men and women, and he probably follows both of those paths at different times and is cool with it. And Rock Hudson is very much following the establishment line of like, I am giving you heteronormative performance and a secret private life and a wedding to a woman who's my agent secretary. And that kind of adds to the underpinning of how the two of them bounce off each other, and it's sort of like, I think there are a lot of different ways where knowing what people were like off screen and whether it's their politics or their personal lives or whatever, how that just kind of colors the what they're portraying on screen. And so, I think in a movie like Giant, that's just inescapable.
Exactly. Well, I know the hardest thing writing any book, but especially running press books where you have only so much time and only so much space.
Yeah.
Was there a person or a subject you wanted to touch on that just for the sake of the amount of space you had, or just the way the narrative was going, you're like, that's gonna have to wait for the paperback version.
I had 95,000 words to cover 130 years of cinema. So yeah, a
Jeez.
lot of things that, I mean, I tried to tag on as many sort of just lists of names and titles at the end of each chapter, but definitely when it came time to like really do the chopping, there were a lot of contemporary, like living, working filmmakers that I wanted to put into the last section. But, because this was a TCM book, I knew I needed to sort of stress the history and stuff. So people like Andrew Haig, people like John Grayson, kind of working queer filmmakers. I just had to be like, you know what, you're great. I love you, but I got to ditch this, unfortunately. So yeah, I think when people in the age of the internet, people think, oh, well, you have, infinite time and space and pages and whatever. It's like, yeah, no, in old school books, you have a limit.
We talk about this a lot when it comes to Black classic film stars and the current trend of right now, Hollywood biopics are more focused on music than they are filmmaking. But when you look at the history of just biopics made about a lot of these people, aside from Gods and Monsters, it's kind of slim pickings for LGBTQ biopics about the classic studio era. And it's a real shame because that would be vastly interesting. Is there an old Hollywood star that you touched on for the book that deserves a biopic about their time in the industry?
Oh God, so many. I mean, you're right. I think there's a lot of things that are just sitting there waiting for somebody to grab them up. And we recently had like that Cary Grant series on BritBox or whatever, but that
Ryan Murphy did Hollywood, which is revisionist.
Very, yes. The BritBox thing, I know pretty much played it straight. And I remember like Mark Rydell did a James Dean biopic.
Yeah, I know. With
Luke
James
Perry?
Franco.
James Franco, right? Thank you.
We talked about that. Which is very, very straight. I know Billy Eichner's talked about trying to make a Paul Lynde biopic happen for
that'd be great.
Several years. Which again, I'm like, dude, what do we need to do? Do we need to kickstart this? I'm ready.
I think an Alan Nazimova biopic would be fascinating. Like, here's this woman who was one of the biggest paid stars in cinema at Metro before it became MGM. She sinks all this money into what is considered now the first American avant-garde film, this wild adaptation of Oscar Wilde's Salome. It tanks, and she has to sell off like this incredible piece of property that she owns at Sunset and Crescent Heights, the Garden of Allah. But still continues to work and tour in the theater, and like apparently her stage work is what inspired Tennessee Williams to become a playwright. So like she just had a lot of ups and downs, but I think would be a really great story, and was very much involved with a lot of men and women of the period.
Valentino, and,
and not I'm trying to remember. There was a woman named Mercedes de Acosta. I don't know who exactly she was, but everybody slept with her apparently. Like she's one of those names that keeps coming up whenever you.
She's the Dorothy DeFrasso of the silent era.
I guess so. Yeah, like she got around and good on her. But yeah, I think Nazimova's story would be really fascinating to tell. As somebody who comes out of Russia, hits big in the U.S., loses it, and nonetheless becomes like this important artist in a lot of ways that still resonates, like the work that she did. But yeah, I would love to see a move away from the music biopic just because I think they're mostly terrible.
They are, and I think the only one. The only reason I knew about Valentino is I think Ken Russell includes her very briefly in the Valentino movie that he did.
Maybe so, yeah.
Which it's very Ken Russell. But I'm honestly shocked we don't have another Valentino movie too. Just at this point, because I get it. The Gen Zers and the Gen Alphas don't know who the hell he is, but
yeah, it's a tough sell. I was really thrilled last year. Paramount put out like a new Blu-ray that was a 100th anniversary release of The Shake. But I also think trying to get people to watch silent movies is like black and white was hard enough. And then you throw silent in there, it's just like really pulling teeth.
What you're saying is Taylor Swift needs to write a song about Valentino.
There we go. Yes. That could turn this ship around.
Well, Alonso, I'm so happy that we got to sit down and talk about your book, Hollywood Pride. It's wherever you get your books. So please purchase it. If you live in LA, I know they have several copies at the Academy Museum because I was just there, and I did not take it personally that they did not have my book, but I'm glad they had everybody else, all my other friends, so that I can at least keep people going and buying books. But Alonso, where can fans find you online? What do you have upcoming that they should be on the lookout for?
Well, I've got some events happening for the book, which I'm very excited about, including at the Academy Museum. Actually, I'm doing a book talk with Justin Simeon, and it'll be followed by a book signing. That's going to be on June 29th. And also a couple nights before that, I'm going to be moderating a Q&A with Greg Araki following a screening of The Living End, which is part of a new queer cinema series that they're doing. And other programs coming up as well. You can follow me. I'm Alonso.Duralde on Instagram. I'm the only Alonso Duralde on earth, so I'm real easy to Google. I'm on Facebook. I'm A Duralde at Blue Sky. And you can read my reviews every week at thefilmverdict.com. And please check out my podcasts, Linoleum Knife with my husband, Dave White, which we've been doing since 2010. Breakfast All Day with Christy Lemire on YouTube and as a podcast. The podcast Maximum Film on the Maximum Fun Network. And Deck the Hallmark, where I pop in once a week to talk about off Hallmark Christmas movies.
You give me faith that my podcast can and will last 10 years. So.
At least.
Thank you so much. That's going to close out this edition of Ticklish Business. Of course, you can find us on all podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get podcasts. Reviews matter, and we would love one in 2024. So please leave us one. 5 stars, please. You can follow us on all social media at ticklish_biz on Twitter, as well as on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at ticklishbiz. I am always online at Kristen Lopez 88. You can also find my official website at KristenKLopez.com. Emily Edwards is at Ms. Emily Edwards on all social as well. Our Patreon, once again, helps keep the lights on at Ticklish Biz HQ and gives us fun opportunities to do all sorts of great things, including our bonus pods and our upcoming international month. So consider helping us out at patreon.com/ticklishbiz. And my book and Emily's book are wherever you buy books. We will return with a new episode soon. Till then,